Okay, all right. So yeah, so you are applying to enter the MArch program at the University of Kent, Kent School of Architecture and Planning. So the university has about 22,000 students, I think. I hope that's a reasonably up-to-date statistic. But the School of Architecture has about 450 students, and it's predominantly that's predominantly made up of undergraduate students on our professional programs. So our Part 1 and Part 2, our BA Hons in architecture and our MArch programs, which are both professionally prescribed and validated as giving exemption from Part 1 and Part 2. And there's a slide in the presentation that I can talk to you a little bit more about that from. But you're looking at a view of the plaza. So essentially this is on the right-hand side of the picture is the what most of us consider to be the rear of the School of Architecture. It's kind of brick-built 1950s, 1965 building. And at the front of the photograph is a digital crit space. So the shiny building with the windows coming through the solar shading is a digital crit space that sometimes we use, very occasionally, but it's largely the taught arena for our Part 1 students. And on the left is our School of Arts. So we essentially almost join, but not quite, the School of Arts. So I will advance the slide. Doesn't want to move. There we go. Yeah. So these are some of our rankings. I wouldn't want my own achievements in life necessarily to be measured by numbers. And I think one of the fascinating things about architecture is that, at least if you go to an interview, and we've had some of those, but if you go to an interview in life, it's very much about what you've done already. So it's not, you don't get that how many elephants fill the room, or what's heavier, a ton of feathers or a ton of, I don't know, coal. That actually conversations are generally based on achievements which you've already demonstrated, not statistically, but not quantitatively, but qualitatively. And that's very much what we're about. So if you're interested in how we rank, there are some statistics out there for you. Generally, we do very well. We tend to fluctuate, and the performance of one school relative to another is very much interrelated. So two schools are on the same ranking, and one better and one slightly worse, then potentially you get these strange shifts. What I'd really suggest you want to do, if you really want to find out how good we are, is to go to the RIBA website. And we were revalidated as recently as the summer of 2019. And when the RIBA validates any schools, they send a board which looks intensively at all the work that we do. And at the end of the report, they can do several things. One of the things is not professionally approve a school. That's never happened to us, and doesn't happen to most schools. But one of the better things they can do is make 3 citations, and no more than 3 citations, essentially 3 special mentions for any given school across all of the programs that they're validating. And this year, or last year in 2019, for the next tranche of, before they reappear in 4 or 5 years' time, they extraordinarily cited the MArch program as distinct and without mention relative to our own Part 1 program, so that not to denigrate that program at all, but just to give you some idea of how well we were regarded at validation last year. So go and look at our validation report, the Kent School of Architecture and Planning, on the RIBA's website, if you really want to know what kind of school we are. Okay, so here's a map of the UK, and somewhat masked by our panelists. So here we are, we're floating in the North Atlantic, it appears, and somewhat ironically, we've edited out most of Europe, which is not the inclination of the School of Architecture and Planning or the university, or pretty much anyone in academia in the UK. And we are the European university, and will continue to be, and have strong links to Europe, both in terms of campuses, but also international partners, currently through the Erasmus program, although that may change as a European Union. And the UK develop different forms of relationship. But we are down here in the southeast corner, essentially. So we're physically and geographically closest to the continent of Europe. Encouraging the slide to change. Right. Yeah. As spoken about already, we are professionally recognised. So not only in with the Architects Registration Board of the UK, which is the statutory body, it holds the legal register of architects in the United Kingdom, and therefore, by extension, unless and until we leave the European Union, throughout the European Union, and the title architect is legally protected within the Union and within the UK. So only people on that register can call themselves architect. There's no actual protection of activity, so anyone can design a skyscraper, but the title architect is protected. The RIBA is a professional chartered institute which protects the interests of architecture in broader, more global terms and nationally. They align their criteria for education with the ARB. So we are jointly recognised by these bodies, but we are also accredited by LAM, the Malaysian Board of Architects, and also the Board of Architects in Singapore, so that we hold international accreditation as well. Yes, so this is the structure of architectural education in the United Kingdom. So if I went back a slide, or why don't I just click to the end so you won't hold anything back. So essentially, undergraduate education in the United Kingdom, technically it's all undergraduate. The reasons for that are historic. So the part 2, the MArch program, is a second degree. It follows an undergraduate degree, so it is in many terms after graduation, postgraduate, but it's a hybrid program. So 120 credits of our program are at master's level and 120 at honours level. And the reason for that is historic, and it was about over certain generations maintaining access to the funding, whether a loan or a grant or a bursary or a scholarship throughout the 5 years, because most undergraduate degrees, most professions, most vocations, most subjects in the United Kingdom at degree level are only 3 years. Architecture and law and medicine are different in the UK in that respect, and they are 5 years. And so to ensure that students who started that continuum were able to complete it without losing access to funding, the decision historically was made to keep the part 2 program at this hybrid level of undergraduate, postgraduate, because if it was purely postgraduate, access to funding was discretionary until very recently. And you'll find that's the case with all part 2, almost all part 2 programs in the United Kingdom. So a 3-year undergraduate degree and a 2-year postgraduate qualification, the part 2, is generally separated by a year of professional practice, so experience in an office, between the 2 parts, and then another year at the end. And these 2 professional bodies, particularly the ARB, which is obviously the statutory body, require a minimum of 24 months before part 3 is undertaken, which is the final part of the 3-part route to entering the Register of Architects in the United Kingdom. And we also, as a university and a School of Architecture and Planning, also offer a part 3 now as well. And there it is. So that started with effect last year, actually. The choices about schools, so there's a churn potentially between these various steps in education. So we benefit from students entering the MArch program at Kent who have completed their undergraduate degree at another UK School of Architecture with part 1 recognition, but equally from schools outside the United Kingdom who may or may not have part 1 and generally don't have part 1 professional recognition. And the great thing is that all graduates from the MArch program at Kent gain part 2 exemption. Okay, so a tiny bit about the culture of the school. I think I'll have to speed up. We also have a series of taught MAs, and I know that a couple of you have also applied in parallel to join one of these programs. Hopefully, should your application for MArch be unsuccessful, not that they are inferior, but they are certainly very different experiences in lecture, and they are generally postgraduate, as in all the credits are at level 7 or master's level. They're 1 year, 1 calendar year, continuous single year taught programs at postgraduate fee, but most importantly, they're not professionally validated, they're not recognized, and that's not to denigrate them either. So most of these non-professional postgraduate programs in architecture that are offered by us, but also offered by other schools of architecture in the UK, are not professionally recognized. They're hybrid, they're specialist, they're very niche, and quite often they appeal to returning mid-career professionals, but also they're an excellent route into academia for people with a first degree in architecture, or perhaps even an MArch, who are seeking to pursue an academic route in life towards teaching and research rather than towards practice. And there's a list of them here. You can find details on the website. Right, so our own program is a 2-year program. So what you're seeing here is a program overview. It's called Draft because I didn't take Draft off, but it's also a nod to the fact that it actually used to look slightly different. And that's a useful reminder to me to say something about study abroad. But essentially, you can see here that we have 2 stages. We call them stage 4 and 5. And if you look at the bars that run across this chart, essentially that's 1 academic year, and that's another academic year. So stage 4 and 5 are separated into 2 academic years. They're taught over a 3-term model. So we have autumn term, spring term, and summer term. Summer term is largely given over to assessment. So presentation, feedback, and assessment. Each one of these terms is broken by a 4-week gap, which is a recess for the Feast of Christmas and Easter, essentially, or the holidays, essentially, for both, which is a 4-week recess through which in the Easter we teach. So we teach every other week through Easter, so that our students are supported in their final run-up to final assessment. The orange modules are taught through units. So we have a very special way of teaching in the MArch at Kent, which is vertical. So students on both of these stages are allocated on the basis of them expressing a choice or preference in their education into a series of units, which essentially chop up these modules vertically into 4 slivers. So each unit creates its own interpretation of these modules for a calendar year, and then reinvents itself the following year. And so there's an opportunity to stay in that group, that unit, or to move to another unit should you wish. And you'll notice this blob at the end of 5th year is technology. So technology for 5th years is also taught through the unit system, so that units should have a particular ethos towards the theory of architecture, but they should also have a particular ethos towards the technology of architecture. And it means that very specific attitude towards technology and theory can be delivered specifically as it relates to students' own projects, and students in these units develop their own briefs over the year. Okay, another slide. So you can also see these other modules essentially, and I think for most of you I've talked about these, but if they're not colored orange, they are taught outside the unit system, outside the design studio, which is a deliberate intent to essentially offer some form of reference or foil to the drama and excitement of the design studio, so that there's a regular diet of theoretical or practical lectures and seminars that continue in parallel with that. So you can see that technology sits at the end of, or the second half of both of the academic years, and that we equip students for the kind of the endeavors of the year in the spring term. So for 4th years, we teach professional practice, cultural context, discourse in architecture in 4th year, and for 5th years, we have 3 parallel options, one being a classic dissertation, the other being artifact, which is a piece of research through practice, and the third one being pedagogy. And maybe I'll let Aubin say something about that, Aubin, towards the end, because Aubin was on pedagogy, which it's a module which makes us unique amongst all schools of architecture in the United Kingdom. Okay, so what we've got here is just an abstract from a catalogue. So every year our students curate an end-of-year show, which is a showcase for the student work within the school, and they also publish a catalogue. The MArch has a section in that catalogue where there's a program introduction and then a series of descriptions about the endeavours of the unit that year, and a showcase of students' work within those units. And I think for most people that I have talked to by Skype on interview, I've shared that link with you. So our catalogues are hosted by Issue Online, and we have last year's, as in 2019, 2018, and I believe somewhere 2017. But I think we've also just started collecting those together, so that actually there's a central resource for them as well. And perhaps we can answer exactly where that is specifically in the chat at the end. But essentially, what you'll see here is a description of the endeavours of the units last year, a broad description, and then it moves to a series of specific considerations of what each delivers. So these are the vertical teaching groups that you elect to join by essentially exercising some choice in your education. So we ask you to write a short statement about why you think you might be a good fit for a particular group, but also respect your ranking of priority in terms of your preferred unit at the beginning of the year. And that's in response to a series of presentations given by the staff, the tutors who run these units, of which there are two. So there's a unit leader and an assistant for each of these units. And additionally, there's a technology tutor who arrives in the spring to also evolve the teaching of technology, particularly for fifth years, but occasionally that at the discretion of each unit, that's also a resource that's open to fourth years as well. So here you can see one of our students, and you can see what we focused on last year. So each of the units has generally a different focus. We've reached steady state, so our population of students is to some extent pretty standard. We have about 75 to 80 students on the program, which means about 15 to 18 students in each unit, half of which are fourth years and half of which are fifth years. So there's an element of peer-to-peer learning, where fourth years push fifth years and fifth years lead fourth years, and the fifth years who have chosen to stay in that unit will have probably the best insight into how the working method of the unit may develop. We don't have a house style in any particular unit. If those units need to develop a facility with a certain software, that's taught within the context of the unit. So Grasshopper or Rhino, for example, to Unit 5, delivers teaching within a taught day in the autumn term. Although we also offer discrete workshops in particular software teaching outside of that on the basis of interest, essentially. So we put them up for students if they're interested. We repeat them if they're undersubscribed, then we substitute one software package with another. So we have 4 units. There is no Unit 2 at the moment. We may grow that back again at some point, perhaps even next year, and that would be in response to demand for places. And we talk to you in very difficult and different times with a global pandemic, and it's very difficult to anticipate at the moment what that will mean for application numbers. So it may impact application both in terms of reducing demand, but it may actually increase demand because as a second degree postgraduate education sometimes increases in size in national or global recessions for reasons that you can probably understand. So we may grow Unit 2 back at some point, but anyway, Units 1, 3, 4, and 5 have their own dedicated page, and in this presentation, we've included the fourth year just to give you some indication that obviously it's not just fifth years in these units. Right. Yes. So Unit 5 actually is run by Tim Ireland, one of my colleagues, who also is our Director of Digital Architecture and also runs a parallel taught MSc or MSc in Biodigital Architecture. So essentially Unit 5 has been so successful over the couple of years it's run as a kind of prototype that it's allowed us to set up a dedicated non-prescribed or validated single-year taught MSc in Biodigital Architecture, which, like Unit 5, takes its inferences from the way that natural systems colonize their environment and how repetition or iteration can inform our attitudes to place, location, site, and those things. Right, student support. Yeah, we have quite a vibrant student organization, I think. So essentially there are initiatives which inform the student experience, which are both promoted by the students themselves, but also offered by the institution. So we have peer mentoring, essentially where MArch students are asked to volunteer for positions where they essentially mentor or nurture undergraduate students as they begin their education in architecture. We have learning support services which are formally delivered to the university for students who are finding their experience suboptimal, and maybe that's because they have learning challenges, maybe they're dyslexic or that there is some advice that they could gain through those services, or that we could understand through a conversation with that department, where we can better structure learning for those students. Pedagogy, I talked about very briefly before. It's an option to dissertation. Essentially, fifth year students, through a dedicated module, supported by a theoretical lecture series and seminars in the how we learn, how we pass on knowledge. And they perform teaching practice, where they join as an addition to a first year tutor, a group of first year students in first year studio to assist with the design, with the delivery of design and communication teaching to first years. So it folds on the first year in particular, and it's unique, and it's fantastic, essentially. And there are some other instances about here notated as to how we support our students. We have lecture series as well. So we have 3 research centres: CREATE, which is essentially an academic centre for research in European architecture theory; DARC, which is Architecture Research Centre; CASE, which is the Centre for Architecture in the Sustainable Environment; and CASA, which is our Kent Architecture Students Association. Should probably have a P in there at some point to reflect the fact that we now have programmes in planning, local authority planning, master planning as well. But each one of those 4 contributors delivers in a reciprocal pattern guest speakers to an extracurricular, as in not part of a module, lecture series, which generally happens on a Tuesday throughout the academic year. And they are free and open generally to everybody. We're also a research school, so most of, but not all of our academic members of staff are pursuing research activities, and the aspiration is always that those in some way inform teaching. And Henrik Schoenfeld here at the moment is almost permanently seconded to the Palace of Westminster. So Henrik's specialism is passive ventilation in institutional buildings, I suppose. And as you may know, that our UK Parliament is being restored over a period of years, which is going to probably extend to at least a decade. And Henrik, our expertise at Kent was so relevant that they approached Henrik to essentially be permanently involved for the duration of that project. Here's another sustainability project. So actually, we're building a kind of scale model of a particular part of London to measure solar reflectivity and urban heat gain. So grants for research actually create tangible research outputs within the context of the school. And here we are back at CASA. So essentially, we have an end of year show, we have a catalogue, we've shown you a couple of pages of that. And we'll do the same thing this year. So as you probably know, most of the world is in lockdown, most universities are closed for face-to-face teaching. We continue to support our students through e-learning, and we will an end of year show catalogue, and we will have some form of e-show, I suspect, as well. But this is a snapshot of some of the previous years, some of the students who were involved, particularly in the committee, but also some of the buzz around the opening event for that, and some of the sponsors as well. Okay, and that's it for the show. So if I escape that, so it's 11:30, and I guess it's an invitation, Andy, to for you to do that. Okay. So just to introduce our other attendees. So we're joined by Andy Kong. So Andy Kong completed his first degree in architecture outside the United Kingdom. In fact, I think Andy in Hong Kong, if that's right, which is where Andy comes from. And he's been with us for 2 years. So he's a good example of someone who's completed, who's new to the MArch at Kent and also new to the programme. And Andy's been in Unit 1 for 2 years. And I suppose whilst I'm talking about people's background, when we get to Aubin, in case I forget, so Aubin is also in Unit 1. He's also 5th year. So Unit 1 is the unit I run. So it's kind of easiest, I suppose, for me to ask at this time where these guys are quite busy already for them to kindly support us today. But Aubin completed his undergraduate degree at Kent. So Aubin differentiates himself from Andy in that he's a continuing Kent student. And they both represent probably half of the constituency of our MArch programme now, where half come from other schools of architecture, many from outside the United Kingdom, and half probably less in a way at this point, come from our own undergraduate program. And our applications are open to applicants from anywhere in the world and from any other school. And we're very proud of our diversity, I suppose, in terms of background in education. So Andy, I'll leave it to you. And I'll shut up and let you talk for perhaps 5 to 10 minutes.
Hello guys, I'm Andy. So maybe I'll share my screen. Just some insights through my work in progress for this year's project. Basically, I'm just going to talk a bit about what we're doing in terms of these kind of stepping stone projects. So we started, our theme was Gothic this year. So we started in series of researches, and also we have field trips, and we also have a lot of design testing and practicing in our studio as well. So we enjoy a lot of model making, drawings, and also we kind of have a lot of inspiration from films as well. In particular, this year, Gothic, as I speak in before, I focused on layering and scale, and also context, movement, technology, and pilgrimage. So basically, we have a series of stepping stone project. We started off with doing some kind of collage. We also have some kind of literature review on different books. For example, I did this John Ruskin's Stone of Venus, and also we do William Morris book. And also we have went through a series of survey drawings in the cathedral in our first project. So basically I've drawn some of the different parts of the cathedral to kind of make a unfolded drawing, basically. And we have this kind of package survey, which kind of we actually take something from our daily life and we kind of draw them out, and we study the context of it, so we can actually compare the kind of the way that Gothic and our daily lives are so different, but they're at the same way quite the same. And why isn't it working? Okay, so yeah, so I moved on to kind of looking at pilgrimage as well. So as our third stepping stone project, we did a palimpsest, almost like a canopy or a pavilion of folly. So at the perimeter of the Canterbury city wall. Down below is our field trip to Milan. Basically, we have a lot of cultural inspiration from the field trip. For example, for me, we visited the Lingotto factory in Turin, which is designed by Renzo Piano. And yeah, we also went through different series of projects around Milan and the city center, and we saw different bits of the place, like we saw some new bits and old bits as well. So quickly moving on to the next step, we kind of have some very traditional, conventional way of understanding the site, and particularly I was quite interested in studying the pollutants and traffic means of Canterbury boundary. So we can see some inspiration that I have evolved in my project. So this happens in the before midterm, and I kind of generate different response, in particular to kind of the traffic pollution problem in Canterbury, basically. And I also research into different kind of filtering system, for example, like respiratory systems, car system, and mechanical means. In particular, I was interested in the catalytic converter, which kind of sucks up the not so efficient combustion of engines from cars, and it kind of sucks up the pollutions from the waste stage of the engines, and I started on developing different forms basically and programs so to put onto the site, and I evolved with different kind of response to the site. Particularly I've invented this kind of towering system, a stacking system for car parking. So we kind of treasure a lot of these kind of innovative ways of putting different programs and different technologies together. So in particular, besides from the towering machine, I also provide almost like a opposition of the mechanical means. I put some kind of human activities besides the other half of my project. So yeah, these are some of the drawings that I did before midterm. I mean, before in the late autumn term. So quickly jumping to the spring term, which is like 2 months ago. So I focused a lot more on the contextual and cultural and also the historical part of Canterbury, which we'll get to know more about when we study in Kent. But basically, I was interested in this Watling Street, which was the Roman road. So we do quite a bit of mapping models, and also I was interested in catalytic converter and try to introduce this kind of poetic way to reuse the wastage of catalytic converter. And particularly my project also evolves with stolen catalytic converters, which are the theft, which are quite common in the States and also in the UK, because basically they are quite worth the fortune, as there are a lot of precious metal inside this mechanism of a car, and it's quite easily accessible. I mean, it's just at the lower bottom of the car, and people just started to realize it's quite valuable, and they took it and they resell it. But in this project, I focus on how to kind of propose this kind of opinion towards this kind of criminology, basically stealing and also different kind of polluting criminals, basically. And I created different means of seeing the issues. And particularly, I tried to rediscover the Roman Watling Street, which is under the ground, buried quite deeply under the ground, and reusing the catalytic converters, melting them into igneous of metals, basically to replace the Roman Watling Street. And of course, I've also studied some of the car mechanics, like turning angles and stuff like that, and how do I direct like pedestrian and also cars into this corner side of near the Canterbury city. And especially in year 5, basically we are quite interested in technology as well. So I actually evolved a bit on technology, especially on the environmental approach. So these are some of the drawings that I produced for understanding the wind tunnel, passive wind tunnel, basically introducing wind through my project. So yeah, these are some of the other drawings that I did physically, and also in some of the softwares that we got privilege for being a student. Basically, I use Autodesk software to run some simulation of wind analysis in my 3D model to study how the air purification progress would be working on my project. And also I did some physical models in study of how different physically components of my project would be working in particularly, I was quite interested in the way that this solar harvesting work. So I incorporated with the pilgrimage, the notion of pilgrimage, and also the notion of rotatory systems. So when the kind of the solar panels will be moving and operated by the response of the solar trajectory, kind of moves from the viewing angle of cathedral to other viewing angles of the city. And yeah, basically these are some of the other drawings, renderings that I've been doing to talk a little bit more about narrative and also the stories behind my project. So actually we are quite interested in this kind of narrative based project. So we kind of evolved into a story behind our project as well as technology. So we got this kind of quite a complex project and also quite hybrid in terms of an architectural project. So yeah, I guess that's it for the moment, I guess.
Andy, thanks very much. It's nice to see the cars have become blue as well. But Andy touches on an interesting point actually, which is that I guess, you know, obviously that different schools of architecture have different emphases, but it's also true to say that whilst we are professionally validated, so we equip students for a career in architecture, that we're also a postgraduate experience. And so there is an intellectual endeavor in the discipline after a first degree and actually during it as well. But not only do our students write dissertations or equivalent, but actually we use narrative, or some units use narrative essentially to advance a theory or a thesis, so that there's an element of magic or magical realism in some of our projects and some of our units, because they can essentially orchestrate or conflate a series of circumstances or conditions that you wouldn't necessarily find in the real world, to essentially up the ante, to kind of increase the kind of collision of ideology or kind of contrast, and so in so doing create a kind of crosshatch that when agitated through the consideration of design creates a level of engagement with the project all the way from the macro or micro to the macro to the micro, that you wouldn't necessarily get in education, you wouldn't necessarily get in practice. So and in so doing we kind of agitate the minds of our students, but also prepare them for practice in a way that perhaps in not so doing would not do. So something that we're kind of proud of, I suppose. But equally, there are just traditional units as well, which take things much more on face value, but then spend a lot of time understanding what actually constitutes that face value, as in how we construct an understanding of the world around us. Aubin, so over to you, I guess. Aubin's going to, so Aubin's presentation, or the kernel of his kernel of his presentation actually grew out of a presentation that he put together to present to our own third year students in our part one. And this is, I mention this because it's another good example of how we as a school evolve a kind of culture of best practice. And so every year our part one third year finalists receive a series of presentations from selected MArch students, generally fifth years, who often talk about their previous year's project because it's essentially complete. And that's at the point in the academic year when these presentations happen, their own projects are still evolving. And I think Aubin's going to talk a little bit about the work this year, but essentially the idea is that there's some insight into the process, both the mechanics of it as in software, but also the evolution of an idea through an iterative process. And Aubin's going to talk about that.
So I'll share my screen. Yeah, so basically I took part in the pedagogy module. And so I had the chance to research into the integration of professional practice into architectural education. So following that, I was asked to compose make this presentation. So the aim was to kind of show different elements that you can integrate and how you can put them to create drawings that can explain your project and can kind of blend ideas together to best explain what you're trying to do. So this particular drawing was quite a quick drawing I produced this year. So this was between the initial project, the palimpsest, so the first term project that we had, and then moving on to the main project in second term. So it was basically an evolution of what I had done in the previous project, which was looking at the facades and the historical image of Canterbury, and looking at elements I could take and use to kind of develop my this second term. So basically, what I wanted to show with this was that so I basically I started off with an idea in mind of what I wanted to show. So basically, I started off with my sketching, the idea of creating these false panels of a composite of historical forms found in Canterbury, and how the overlaying and composite of them can enhance the historical image and branding, I guess, of the city of Canterbury, and kind of improve its tourism image. So this is just how I went on about producing this drawing. So I started off with the idea, and then I made this model. So it's literally extracting elements that I've discovered within my site, kind of making them in different materialities. So you get different opacities, different forms, different types of ornamentation, etc. Overlaying them and then getting this composite of forms. So from this basic model, you can always show more, right? So I went on to try and create a composite and a collage of using other elements to kind of push forward this idea. So yeah, so I had my images. So basically on Photoshop, simply adding filters to give it a style. So I use this filter, the noise filter. So basically, it's a quite a good filter to kind of blend images together to create sceneries and these type of drawings where you collage different images. And then kind of warping this model into accentuating its perspectives and to give it more depth. So then this is the elevation of the high street of Canterbury. So because my project was based in Canterbury, I would give it some locality. So I added both my projects were based on either side of the Canterbury High Street. So I thought the junction of these would be an elevation of the high street between the two sites. Then placing this into the background of my model, and in the background the Canterbury Cathedral. Shading, adding depth. So this is all quite basic stuff, but just to show how much layers you can add to these type of drawings. So the model in itself is a piece of my project, but I used it to enhance and to create another drawing that would actually explain a lot more to my idea and my concept. So adding the people, the perspective, and so that's the finished product. So from that, in the actual physical model, there's the idea is there, but the main elements aren't really portrayed. So here I'm kind of isolating the part that I want to try and show, and at the same time giving its locality in the context of Canterbury, and the idea with the tourists looking at that model in the background, Canterbury. So that was the explanation of this particular drawing. I don't know if Mike, there's something else I could talk about.
Unmute myself. No, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that was the intention was to, therefore, thanks Aubin, to give you attendees some insight into essentially how we do it and what we do, and also therefore in the previous things that we've shown you, a back catalogue of essentially how that fits into the history of the program.